The heartbreaking truth behind Chad's absence. The courtroom fell silent as the clock ticked past the appointed hour. An empty chair sat at the defendant's table, speaking volumes without uttering a single word. For anyone watching, the message seemed crystal clear. A father had chosen to abandon his responsibilities at the most critical moment. But in the shadows of Salem, a far darker truth was unfolding that would shatter hearts and challenge everything the community thought they knew about family, loyalty, and the lengths someone would go to destroy the DiMera legacy. The day everything changed. Thursday morning began like any other day in Salem, but for the DiMera family, it would mark a turning point that nobody could have anticipated. The custody hearing for Thomas and Charlotte DiMera was scheduled to proceed at the courthouse, a legal proceeding that would determine where these two innocent children would call home. Their father, Chad, should have been the first person to arrive, dressed in his finest suit, armed with evidence of his devotion and capability as a parent. Instead, his absence created a void that spoke louder than any testimony could have. Jennifer Horton Devereaux sat in the courtroom with her husband Jack and their two grandchildren, her expression a mixture of righteous anger and deep disappointment. She had given Chad every opportunity to prove himself as a father. She had watched him struggle and grow, celebrated his victories, and supported him through his losses. But dismissing the custody hearing entirely seemed to confirm her worst fears about the DiMera influence corrupting even the best intentions. The whispers started almost immediately. Other people in the courtroom, there for their own legal matters, couldn't help but notice the drama unfolding. They exchanged knowing glances and hushed comments. It was the kind of gossip that would spread through Salem like wildfire by lunchtime. Ted DiMera, once thought to be a devoted father, had apparently shown his true colors by failing to appear when his children needed him most. Young Thomas sat beside his grandmother, his small hands folded in his lap, trying to be brave the way his father had always taught him. But the confusion in his eyes betrayed his true feelings. Where was his daddy? Why hadn't he come? Had Thomas done something wrong to make his father stay away? These painful questions swirled in the boy's mind, questions that no child should ever have to ask themselves. Charlotte, even younger than her brother, didn't fully understand the proceedings, but she sensed the tension in the room. She kept looking toward the courtroom doors, expecting at any moment to see her father rush through them with an explanation and an apology. But the doors remained closed, and her father remained absent, and with each passing minute, the damage to their relationship grew deeper. A desperate plea falls on deaf ears. Outside the courthouse, in the bustling town square where Salem's residents went about their daily business, an explosive confrontation was about to take place. Kat Green had spent the entire morning trying to reach Chad, growing increasingly worried with each unanswered call. Something was wrong, she knew it in her bones. The man she had grown close to in recent months would never willingly miss this hearing. He had talked about nothing else for weeks, preparing his case, gathering evidence, planning every detail to prove he was the best parent for his children. When Kat spotted Jennifer crossing the square, she made a decision that would prove both brave and futile. She approached the older woman with determination in her stride, her mind racing with arguments and pleas that might convince Jennifer to see reason. If they could just postpone the hearing for a few days, surely Chad would surface with an explanation. Surely there was some misunderstanding that could be cleared up. The conversation that followed was anything but civil. Kat, her voice urgent and pleading, proposed a deal. She asked Jennifer to consider requesting a postponement from the judge, to give Chad just a little more time to appear. She spoke of the man she knew responsible, loving, utterly devoted to Thomas and Charlotte. She insisted that his absence must have an explanation beyond simple irresponsibility or cowardice. But Jennifer, her patience exhausted and her protective instincts for her grandchildren in full force, was in no mood to negotiate. Years of watching the DiMera family drama unfold had hardened her heart against excuses and elaborate explanations. From her perspective, the situation was painfully simple. A father had chosen not to show up for his own custody hearing. What possible explanation could justify that level of negligence? The accusation that Jennifer hurled at Kat cut through the town square like a knife. She called the younger woman a predator, suggesting that Kat was enabling Chad's worst impulses and hurting the children in the process. It was a harsh judgment, delivered with the full force of a grandmother's protective fury. The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back, creating a rift that would be difficult to heal. Passers-by stopped to watch the confrontation, some pretending to window shop while others openly stared. Salem was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and this public argument would be discussed in every coffee shop and hair salon before the day was done. Kat's desperate attempt to defend Chad had backfired spectacularly, making him look even worse in the court of public opinion. As Jennifer walked away, her decision made and her resolve strengthened, Kat stood alone in the square, fighting back tears of frustration and fear. She knew that the hearing would proceed, that Chad's absence would be interpreted in the worst possible light, and that there was nothing she could do to stop the wheels of justice from turning. Somewhere in Salem, Chad needed help, but nobody was looking for him because nobody knew he needed to be found. A grandfather's wisdom in dark times. Back at the courthouse, Jack Devereaux recognized the toll this situation was taking on his grandson. Thomas was trying so hard to be strong, to hold back the tears and confusion that threatened to overwhelm him. Jack, who had made more than his share of mistakes as a father and had spent years trying to make amends, understood the weight the boy was carrying. Finding a quiet moment before the hearing resumed, Jack pulled Thomas aside to a bench in the courthouse hallway. The conversation that followed was gentle, filled with the kind of wisdom that only comes from experience and hard-earned understanding. Jack didn't make excuses for Chad's absence, but he did try to help Thomas understand that life sometimes presents situations far more complicated than they initially appear. He spoke to his grandson about the importance of keeping love in your heart even when you're hurt, about how sometimes the people we care about disappoint us, but that doesn't necessarily mean they don't love us. He told Thomas that being strong didn't mean pretending everything was fine, it meant feeling your feelings while still believing that better days would come. These were lessons Jack had learned the hard way, through years of his own struggles and redemption. Thomas listened, his young face serious beyond his years, trying to absorb his grandfather's words and find comfort in them. He wanted to believe that his father had a good reason for missing this important day. He wanted to trust that the man who had read him bedtime stories and taught him to ride a bike and promised to always be there would never abandon him on purpose. But the empty chair in the courtroom told a different story, one that was harder to ignore with each passing minute. Justice proceeds without mercy. Judge Dabney took her seat at the bench with a troubled expression. She had presided over countless custody cases throughout her career, but something about this one didn't sit right with her. The father's complete absence, combined with the lack of any direct communication, raised red flags that her judicial instincts couldn't ignore. Before proceeding with the ruling, she began asking pointed questions about Chad's disappearance. When had someone last seen him in person? When had anyone had an actual conversation with him, not just received a text message? The answers that came back painted a disturbing picture. While Chad's phone had been active, sending regular updates that seemed to indicate he was fine and simply choosing not to attend the hearing, nobody could pinpoint the last time they had actually interacted with him face-to-face. The judge's questions revealed something that should have raised alarms earlier: the difference between digital communication and human contact. In an age where people conducted entire relationships through screens, it was frighteningly easy to impersonate someone through text messages. The thought crossed Judge Dabney's mind that perhaps something more sinister was at play, but without concrete evidence, she couldn't let speculation derail the proceedings. The text messages from Chad's phone had been remarkably consistent. They referenced specific locations and activities, mentioned checking in later, and generally painted the picture of someone who was occupied with other matters. To anyone receiving these messages, it seemed like Chad was simply making poor choices, prioritizing other commitments over his children. The messages never explicitly said he wouldn't attend the hearing, but they created an impression of someone who was distracted and unreliable. Jennifer presented these text messages as evidence of Chad's neglect. "Look," they seemed to say, "he's been in contact. He knows about the hearing. He's simply choosing not to come." The logic was sound on the surface, and without evidence to the contrary, it was the most reasonable interpretation of the available facts. Judge Dabney faced an impossible dilemma. Children couldn't wait indefinitely while adults sorted out their complicated lives. Thomas and Charlotte needed stability, security, and a home where they knew they were wanted and cared for. The law provided clear guidelines for situations like this, and despite her misgivings, she had to follow them. With visible reluctance but legal certainty, the judge made her ruling. Full custody of both Thomas and Charlotte DiMera would be granted to Jack and Jennifer Devereaux on a temporary basis. The decision would remain in effect until Chad either appeared to contest it or circumstances changed significantly enough to warrant reconsideration. She emphasized the temporary nature of the order, leaving the door open for Chad to walk through if he ever chose to do so. The gavel fell with a sound that seemed to echo through the courthouse corridors. In that single moment, everything changed. Jennifer felt relief mixed with sadness had won custody, but at what cost? Thomas felt his world shift beneath him, and certainty replacing the security he had always known. And somewhere beneath the streets of Salem, Chad felt a chill run down his spine, sensing somehow that something terrible had just happened, though he didn't yet know what. Awakening to a nightmare. Friday's dawn brought no light to the depths of the DiMera family crypt. Chad's eyes opened slowly, consciousness returning with a throbbing headache and a confusion so complete it bordered on panic. The darkness around him was absolute, broken only by a dim light source he couldn't immediately identify. Stone walls rose on all sides, cold and unyielding, and the air carried the musty scent of a place long sealed from the world above. As his vision adjusted and his mind began to clear, Chad became aware of two figures nearby. The shock of recognition hit him like a physical blow. Tony DiMera and Kristen DiMera, both watching him with expressions that mixed relief at seeing him awake with dread at what his presence meant. Tony spoke first, his cultured voice carrying a weight of exhaustion and resignation. He explained the situation in terms that seemed too bizarre to be real, yet the stone walls around them confirmed every word. They were victims of a systematic kidnapping plot targeting DiMera family members. Someone with intimate knowledge of the family, with resources and planning capability far beyond the ordinary criminal, had orchestrated their capture and imprisonment. Kristen added her own observations, her usual sharp edge softened by genuine fear. She had been the first to disappear, and when Tony followed, they both realized they were dealing with someone who had a comprehensive plan. The kidnapper wasn't acting on impulse or opportunity. This was a carefully executed strategy to remove DiMeras from Salem society one by one. The crypt itself, Chad realized with growing horror, was the perfect prison. Built generations ago to house the remains of departed DiMera family members, it was designed to be sealed and secure. The thick stone walls would muffle any sound, prevent any escape, and ensure that those trapped within remained hidden from the world above. It was both a tomb and a cage, and the irony of being imprisoned in his own family's memorial was not lost on Chad. As Tony and Kristen explained the provisions that had been left for them, the full scope of the kidnappers' intentions became clear. There was enough food and water to sustain them for weeks, possibly months. This wasn't a ransom situation where quick payment would lead to quick release. The kidnapper planned to keep them here for an extended period, and the question of why haunted all three captives. The pattern emerges. As the three DiMeras compared notes about their captures, a chilling pattern emerged. Each had been taken during a moment of vulnerability, when they were alone and distracted. Each had been drugged or otherwise incapacitated before they could call for help. And most telling, each of their phones had been taken and used to send messages that maintained the illusion that everything was normal. Kristen had supposedly left town for business. Tony had allegedly decided to visit family abroad. And Chad, as they discussed with growing horror, was apparently sending messages indicating he was too busy to attend his own custody hearing. The kidnapper understood psychology and social dynamics well enough to craft believable cover stories, using each person's own communication style against them. The realization of how thoroughly they had been isolated was crushing. Nobody was looking for them because nobody knew they were missing. Their friends and family weren't worried, they were disappointed or angry, believing the captives had chosen to disappear. The kidnapper had turned their loved ones' emotions against them, creating a barrier of hurt feelings that prevented anyone from questioning the digital Fawade. Tony, ever the strategist, began analyzing who might be next. If the pattern held, any DiMera in Salem could be targeted. They discussed the possibilities with growing urgency. If he returned to town, Johnny and Sydney, though surely the kidnapper wouldn't target children, and most worryingly, Theo Carver, who carried DiMera blood through his late mother Lexi. Chad's reaction to Theo's name being mentioned was visceral. Theo had already endured so much trauma in his young life, shooting that had left him struggling with brain injury, the loss of his mother. The endless challenges of navigating a world that didn't always understand or accommodate his needs. The thought of Theo being dragged into this nightmare, trapped in darkness and confusion, filled Chad with a protective rage that momentarily overcame his own fear. But even that terror paled compared to Chad's anguish over what was happening above ground. As Tony and Kristen explained about the text messages being sent from his phone, the full horror of his situation crashed down on him. The custody hearing. The one thing he had been preparing for, the one moment where he needed to be present to fight for his children. And he had missed it. A father's torment. The emotional torture of his situation was exquisite in its cruelty. Chad could picture the scene in perfect detail. The courtroom, Jennifer's disappointed face, Jack's concern for the children, and most painfully, Thomas and Charlotte's confusion and hurt. He knew exactly what conclusions they would draw from his absence. In their young minds, there could be only one explanation: Daddy had chosen something else over them. The Thanksgiving holiday had just passed, or perhaps was passing while he lay trapped in stone and darkness. Chad tried to calculate how long he had been unconscious, how many days he had lost, but time had become fluid and uncertain in the crypt. Had the children waited for him at the Thanksgiving table? Had they kept checking the door, expecting him to arrive with apologies and presents? The image of their disappointed faces was almost more than he could bear. Kristen, showing a rare moment of compassion, tried to offer comfort. She assured Chad that children were resilient, that they would understand once he was free and could explain. But her words rang hollow in the stone chamber. Chad knew that some hearts went too deep for simple explanations to heal. He knew that Thomas, who idolized his father, would carry the wound of this abandonment for a long time. The betrayal wasn't just in the missed hearing or the ruined holiday. It was in the message his absence sent, that he didn't care enough to fight for them. Every child's deepest fear is that they aren't important enough, that they aren't loved enough, that they could be easily abandoned. And now, through no fault of his own, Chad had confirmed those fears for his own children. Tony observed Chad's anguish with a heavy heart, remembering his own complicated relationship with his children over the years. He understood the particular torture of being separated from family, of being unable to explain or defend yourself, of watching relationships crumble from a distance. He knew that even when they eventually escaped, and he had to believe they would escape, the damage being done now would take years to repair. The invisible chains. The physical imprisonment in the crypt was only one dimension of their captivity. The psychological warfare being waged through their stolen phones was perhaps even more effective. The kidnapper had weaponized their own communication tools against them, turning their voices into instruments of deception and destruction. Chad thought about Kat, about her desperate attempt to defend him that he knew nothing about. She would be facing the town's judgment alone, her reputation tarnished by association with someone everyone now saw as an irresponsible father. She would be fighting battles for him while he lay helpless in the dark, unable to even send her a message of thanks or reassurance. He thought about Julie, his grandmother figure, who had always believed in him even when others doubted. What must she be thinking now? Had she joined the chorus of disappointment, or was she one of the few still holding out hope that there was an explanation? The uncertainty was agonizing. Most of all, he thought about his children tucked into beds at Jack and Jennifer's house, whispering to each other in the darkness as children do when the world stops making sense. Did Thomas try to be strong for his little sister, explaining away their father's absence with childhood logic that made the pain bearable? Did Charlotte cry herself to sleep, too young to understand but old enough to feel the loss? The kidnapper, whoever they were, had crafted a punishment far more sophisticated than simple imprisonment. They had found a way to make Chad's own family into instruments of his torture, their disappointment and hurt echoing in his mind more powerfully than any physical pain could. And the worst part was knowing that this was just the beginning, that with each day that passed, the damage would grow deeper and the path to redemption would become steeper. Questions without answers. As the three captives sat in their stone prison, they began the difficult work of trying to understand their situation. Who had done this? The questions circled endlessly, with each of them offering theories that seemed both plausible and impossible. Someone with deep knowledge of the DiMera family history would know about the crypt, would understand its layout and security features. Someone with technical skill could intercept their phones and mimic their communication styles. Someone with resources could plan and execute multiple kidnappings without leaving obvious traces. And someone with a serious grudge against the DiMera family would have motivation to orchestrate this elaborate revenge. The list of people who met all those criteria was both longer and shorter than they wanted to contemplate. The DiMera family had made enemies throughout generations of business dealings, personal conflicts, and the general chaos that seemed to follow them wherever they went. But enemies capable of this level of planning and execution were rare. This required patience, intelligence, and a deep commitment to whatever endgame the kidnapper had in mind. Kristen wondered aloud whether this was about money, whether ransom demands would eventually come. But Tony shook his head, pointing out that keeping them fed and watered for an extended period didn't fit a quick ransom scenario. This felt more like someone who wanted them removed from Salem permanently, or at least long enough for some other plan to unfold above ground. Chad, his mind still reeling from the custody revelations, wondered if this could be connected to the hearing somehow. But the timing didn't quite work. Kristen and Tony had been taken before his custody issues had reached a critical point. Unless the kidnapper had been planning for months, anticipating events that hadn't even happened yet when they began their campaign. The uncertainty was perhaps the hardest part. Not knowing who had done this, or why, or what they hoped to achieve left the captives unable to plan or prepare. They could only wait in their stone prison, hoping that eventually someone above ground would see through the deception, that someone would start asking the right questions, that someone would come looking for them before it was too late. A town divided by invisible walls. Above ground, Salem continued its daily rhythms, unaware of the drama unfolding in the depths beneath its streets. Jennifer settled Thomas and Charlotte into their new temporary home, trying to create stability and routine for children whose world had been upended. Jack wrestled with doubts he couldn't quite articulate, wondering if they had missed something important in their rush to judgment. Kat sat alone in her apartment, staring at her phone, willing it to ring with news of Chad. Her confrontation with Jennifer had left her shaken and isolated, but it hadn't diminished her certainty that something was wrong. She began making calls, asking questions, trying to find someone who had actually seen Chad in person recently rather than just received text messages. And in the DiMera mansion, empty rooms echoed with absence. Staff members went about their duties, maintaining a household whose master had seemingly vanished. A few of them exchanged worried glances, remembering other times when DiMeras had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, but fear of being dismissed as gossips kept them quiet. The tragedy was that all the pieces were there for someone to solve the puzzle. The pattern of text-only communication. The convenient timing of multiple DiMeras being out of town or unavailable. The complete lack of in-person sightings. But grief, anger, and hurt feelings created blind spots that prevented people from